It's Friday, April 4th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, the Great American Retreat. It's a two-topic episode today, but both are about this week how the United States made the choices to stop being a global leader in the economy and in public health. That's right, we are going to be talking about Trump's new, bizarre, and wildly damaging tariffs and the administration's decision to gut health agencies this week, effectively hobbling the U.S. from maintaining its spot as the place other countries turn to get their top-shelf medical research and advice. And it's why I asked University of Michigan professor of public health, Dr. Scott Greer, to come back on the show this week. Last time we talked, we were talking about the hypotheticals of losing some of these agencies under someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and now we have to talk about them in the actuality and maybe, just maybe, how there might be a very small silver lining to breaking these agencies beyond repair. But we'll get to that in a little bit. And let's start here with the tariffs because apparently MAGA actually stands for Make America Gilded Again. On Wednesday this week, President Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden with several charts and graphs saying that dozens of countries would now be hit with what he was calling reciprocal tariffs from the U.S. As he explained it, but every country that does trade with the U.S. starts with a blanket 10% tariff, except Canada and Mexico, which we'll talk about in a second here. And then things would go up from there, is what he said. And before we get into some of the numbers here, I'm really going to try to make this not a numbers-heavy episode, but also we are talking about the economy, so there is going to be some math on this test. But let's go over what a tariff is really quickly. Simply put, a tariff is an added cost on a good that is imported from another country. Now, that cost is almost always paid for by the company that is buying that good and importing it into their country. In this case, it would be a U.S. company importing something from another country. And rather than eating that cost and keeping prices the same when they go to sell that good or whatever it's used in, companies raise those prices to offset the cost of the tariff, which then gets passed on us, effectively acting as a sales tax. More on that later. Now back to the Rose Garden. Trump, during this speech, stood around these charts, which had a seemingly random assortment of countries. And I don't mean that they didn't have a purpose. It's just they weren't in order from like most tariffed to least tariffed. It was just sort of like this country's getting 1%, this country's getting another percent. I'll talk about that here in a second. But this chart said that these were countries that had outsized tariffs on U.S. goods, and then next to that in another column were the reciprocal tariffs that the administration was going to levy. So on this chart were countries like China, which apparently was charging 67% tariffs on U.S. imports. South Africa, a 60% tariff. India, 52%. The European Union, our very close allies, had a 39% tariff. And in return, these places were getting huge tariffs placed on their goods when they come into the U.S. Again, that is a cost paid by us and U.S. companies. Now, China is getting an additional 34% tariff, which is on top of the 20% tariff that Trump already put in place on Chinese goods, which means China is now going to be facing a 54% tariff. It is unheard of in modern economics. And they're also one of our largest trading partners, adversary or not. The EU is also getting a 20% tariff. Famously, neutral Switzerland, a 31% tariff, because the Trump administration says Switzerland had a 61% tariff on the U.S., and many of the countries that make our clothes, like Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Cambodia, are being hit with tariffs in the mid-40%. Again, those are costs we end up paying. So the only major countries that didn't get their own tariffs were Canada, Mexico, and Russia. Now, Russia is likely because Trump just really likes Vladimir Putin and doesn't want to make him upset as they're trying to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine, although Ukraine was hit with these 10% tariffs as well. Now, when it comes to Canada and Mexico, it's a little bit more interesting and more confusing because for the last few weeks, Trump has been raging against Canada and Mexico and trade between those two countries and the United States. But it turns out that most of the goods from Canada and Mexico are exempt from these tariffs, except for a 25% tariff that Trump is putting on cars and car parts that are assembled in Canada and Mexico, which will absolutely raise the price of cars here in the U.S. without exemption. Now, as economists and journalists looked at these charts, the math just really didn't make sense. It was unclear where the administration was getting their tariff numbers from in the first place, and then how they were calculating the responsive tariffs. Here's how Trump said they worked.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple. Can't get any simpler than that.
So, an eye for an eye. That's what the president says. Except you'd think that would mean that these numbers would be equal then, but they're not. So that didn't make sense either. And then the administration clarified and said these numbers were based on a careful calculation of existing tariffs and then what are called non-tariff trade barriers, things like import laws in countries around things like health standards, for example. Well, that didn't make sense either, because it turns out the numbers for the tariffs that these other countries had on the U.S. weren't correct in a lot of these cases. For instance, that 31% tariff that the U.S. says Switzerland has on us isn't real. More than 99% of the things imported into Switzerland from the U.S. don't have a tariff at all, and those that do have a very low rate. Japan, which the Trump administration says had a 46% tariff on U.S. goods, actually has a 4% tariff on all U.S. goods, with their highest tariff being directed at farm products at about 15%. You don't have to know all these numbers I'm rattling off. Just know that this doesn't make sense. So naturally, there were more questions. And then later, the White House says this was all based on a formula that White House economists used, which wasn't very helpful. And as more people looked at this, it seems to be that the White House took the trade deficit of each of these countries, meaning the difference between the imports and exports between the two countries, our country and their country, and then from there took that number and divided it by the country's exports to the U.S., which by nearly every serious economic standard is a really stupid way to do this because it harms countries and the U.S. way more than necessary. Case in point, the island territory of St. Pierre and Miquelon, which is a teeny tiny little island off the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada. It has a population of about 5,800 people and only exports about $3.5 million worth of things to the U.S. each and every year. But the White House decided, using their formula, that $3.5 million comes out to about a 99% tariff on U.S. goods that are imported to this tiny island. So the U.S. slapped a 50% tariff on them back, which will devastate this tiny island economy that sends things like lobster to Maine. It's unreal. And on top of that, there is growing evidence that the Trump administration might have used an AI algorithm to calculate these tariff rates. Several journalists online have already started to reverse engineer what formula they're using. And they found that when you ask large language models, so things like ChatGPT, to easily decide how to calculate tariffs, you get back the exact thing that the Trump administration is using. Now, that makes a lot of sense. For starters, it's how this administration has approached a lot of the sweeping things they've done. I mean, just take a look at what the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk have been doing and how much they've used AI to eliminate certain things. But then there's the thing, and say what you will about the people who are working as Trump's economic advisors, they're still serious business people who made millions and billions of dollars and have at least some basic understanding of how economics work. And no one with any real understanding of the economy would choose to do tariffs this way because it's the easiest, least specific, and most damaging way to issue tariffs. It really does seem like the kind of answer you would get from something like a ChatGPT or a Grok, which is what Elon Musk's Twitter AI is called. So that's how we got to the tariffs. And in the immediate hours after they were announced, the stock market started to tumble. And as I'm recording here, it's fallen more than 1,600 points just today alone after falling for 3 straight days, which the former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers said has already cost the average American family of 4 $300,000, or over more than $30 trillion from the entire economy that just disappeared, which has people like the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, to say that tariffs risk raising inflation and slowing economic growth that the U.S. has seen since the end of COVID, and that inflation we've brought down over the last couple of years. And other economists say what these tariffs will amount to is a $6 trillion tax on American consumers, essentially reversing everything that Trump, one, said he was going to do, and that the lowering the price of goods was the number one reason people voted for him in the first place. And all of this has led to warnings that the U.S. is headed straight for a recession, if not a real depression, which is obviously bad economically, but it also means that people will die by the thousands. And just a warning here, I'm going to be talking about suicide. If this is a trigger for you, skip ahead about 90 seconds or so. A study in The Lancet in 2012 found that in the first 3 years of the housing crash recession in the late aughts, suicide rates jumped 425%, or roughly an added 5,000 people between 2007 and 2010 as unemployment skyrocketed. Most of those deaths were in western rural states, the Midwest, and the South. And far and away, the states with the highest numbers, not unlike COVID, were the states with Republican governors and majority Republican voters. Meaning when unemployment goes up again, as the economy contracts over the next several months and maybe several years, as it's projected to do if things don't change, the people who will be harmed the most will be Trump's own voters. And then there's the global view of these tariffs, with even people like former Vice President Mike Pence, who is, not a liberal dude, has been out here for the past few days saying the tariffs are wrong, they're bad for national security, posting videos of Ronald Reagan, who was a proponent of free trade. Which gets to the point of the episode here. What these tariffs do is signal that the U.S. is pulling back from the global economy, and the world is responding in kind to keep us there. China is already putting on retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. Our allies in Europe are already prepping their first round of tariffs on the U.S., with the major economic countries of the EU, France and Germany, saying we should just walk away from the U.S. as far as possible right now. Japan and South Korea have already said they're making a deal with China to be more independent from the U.S., and there are already concerns the EU might do the same. The tariffs also mean that foreign companies have started to pull back and in some cases start the process of pulling out of the U.S. economy entirely, which will cause more contraction, which will raise prices. And then there's been a lot of talk about the return of greedflation. So if you haven't heard me talk about this before, this is the term used for when companies artificially raise prices, hoping to hide those fake price hikes in something like inflation, or in this case, increased costs because of tariffs, to make more money than they would have normally. We saw it all throughout COVID, and people like Mark Cuban have been warning about it this week. So if these are the consequences of the tariffs, the big questions are, why is Trump doing this? And more importantly, why are the people around him and why are Republicans letting him do it? Well, first, Trump and Republicans just don't like trade deficits, that we're paying another country more money than they're paying us when it comes to trading goods and services. It's what Trump means when he says other countries have been ripping us off for decades. Now, deficits aren't inherently bad. A lot of times, it's just a basic supply and demand thing. I mean, things like coffee or bananas are things that we just can't produce in the numbers we need them here in the U.S., so we have to import them from another place. Or even things like rare earth minerals for electronics, or in some cases, things like steel. We just don't have enough to meet the demand here in the U.S., so we have to import more from a country than the amount of things that we send them. But then there's also this thing that We have, because as the world has gotten more and more interconnected after World War II, it's been cheaper to make things in other places outside the U.S., like clothes or appliances, and we as consumers have gotten used to paying those low prices. But trade deficits also give other countries access to the U.S. economy a little easier, which is the largest, and then up until this week, the most lucrative and expansive economy in the world. And that's meant global peace and widespread American influence, oftentimes in countries that we don't have a great relationship with in the first place, like China. These companies that do business here in the U.S. have governments of their own to answer to, and those governments also answer to those businesses. So let's say China is getting ready to invade Taiwan. The U.S. used to be able to say, if you do that, we'll harm you economically so bad that you'll wish that we bombed you instead. It was a bucks, not bullets diplomacy, and it helped foster the safest time to be human and alive that we've ever seen on this planet. But none of that seems to matter to the administration or the people around Trump. And for Trump, it's really not just about the deficits or the idea of getting ripped off. Trump personally likes tariffs. He has for a long time, since he was in New York in the 1980s. And with these tariffs, he gets to make an obsession of his real, which is his wish to be like former President William McKinley. Here he is talking about his vision for the U.S. under these tariffs.
From 1789 to 1913, we were a tariff-backed nation, and the United States was proportionately the wealthiest it has ever been. So wealthy, in fact, that in the 1880s, they established a commission to decide what they were going to do with the vast sums of money they were collecting. We were collecting so much money so fast, we didn't know what to do with it. Isn't that a nice problem to have? What do you think, Marco? Good problem? Marco would love that problem. But we don't have that problem anymore, but we're not going to have it very much longer, I will tell you.
So I want to be really clear here. Before World War I was the Gilded Age, which, yes, the U.S. was very wealthy. It was also extremely protectionist, which means we didn't do a lot of trading with other countries, and isolationist, which means we didn't get involved with other countries very often, and we were very cut off from the world and the global economy. And all of the wealth in the U.S. was at the very, very top of the income bracket, the 0.001% of the United States, which, you know, for Trump, he and the people around him would be in this new Gilded Age. But this time period also gave us robber barons, massive wealth inequality, normalized child labor in dangerous jobs and factories, abhorrent working and living conditions, and massive disease outbreaks like cholera. Those things were undone in large part because of massive progressive undertakings from presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, which those kinds of huge government programs to offset some of these things just aren't what Trump is proposing happens next, and Republicans certainly aren't doing that as they try to shrink the government down. So embodying McKinley has been something that Trump has mentioned before a lot during his first 3 months here. I wrote about this on the Make It Make Sense Substack a few weeks ago, and it still holds true now. McKinley was a protectionist, an isolationist, and he was also an imperialist and an expansionist who annexed the Philippines and Hawaii by force. And Trump invokes McKinley, especially when he's been talking about Greenland or Gaza or Canada. And now he's talking about it when it comes to the economy. And McKinley also imposed his tariffs to help manufacturing, which is what Trump says he wants to do here. But this was the late 1890s. You know, cars didn't exist yet. Our top manufacturing concerns at the time were foreign tin affecting the U.S. pie plate industry, or the cheap price of European wool harming American sheep. I mean, things like molasses and animal hides were so important to the entire U.S. economy in the 1890s that they were exempt from tariffs. We don't live in that world anymore. And people around Trump know that. So what are they thinking? I'll go short-term to long-term here. First, they really do think that tariffs will help American manufacturing and create jobs. The idea of tariffs is you make foreign goods more expensive, and then that forces companies to move their operations to the U.S., and that will create jobs and more money here at home. Does that work? Yes, but mostly no. In 2017, when Trump put tariffs on China, the EU, Canada, Mexico, and South Korea, it did bring back several thousand steel worker jobs and jobs for appliance companies. But those jobs gains were effectively wiped out by the rest of the economy, forcing to fire people because the economy contracted. So, do the tariffs work for a specific group? Maybe, sure. But it does harm the rest of the U.S. in the long run. And let's talk about the long run here. Here's how the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Donald Trump said it on Fox News this week.
When it comes to who pays for the tariffs, at the end of the day, the person who pays for an economic policy is what economists would call the more inflexible person. And the example that I like to give is if you're buying a house. So you're looking at a town to buy a house, and then the town raises the property tax rate. You can just decide to move to look at the next town over. But the person selling the house can't pick up the house and move it. You're flexible. The seller is inflexible. The seller has to lower their selling price to eat the property tax.
Well, that's a...
And the same thing...
I love that. Look, Kevin Hassett and I have talked about this for years. I mean, I think I like to use China as the exporting nation. But the exporters who are hit by that, they're going to have to eat half of it. They're going to eat half of it. I think that's what the evidence shows.
They'll eat much more than half because they're inflexible and we're flexible because we can substitute to home production. We can substitute to different countries to import from. The countries that have built their entire economies around exporting to the American consumer have no substitute. They are inflexible. They will eat the burden of the tax in the long run. And what that means.
So most economists agree that this is nonsense. And even some of Trump's own economic people, like Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent and Trump himself, have said that tariffs are likely going to cause a lot of pain, possibly a recession, because they know that companies can't just pick up and move operations back to the U.S. in a short amount of time. It might be cheaper in the long run for them to just pay the tariffs, pass on the cost to us, and wait out a Trump presidency. Now, like I said, Trump himself even admitted that there would be issues with this, and that it could take at least 2 years to see any kind of a manufacturing boom because of how long it takes to get factories and plants back up and running and to train people to work in those places. And with that, there's been a lot of talk in the finance industry that Trump might be trying to purposefully trigger a recession. The chief information officer at a leading financial advisory firm told Business Insider this week, it's definitely not some sort of fringe conspiracy theory about Trump wanting to cause a recession. I think it's a coin flip as to whether or not it's the intention. That's a staggering thing to hear from somebody who works with money all day long. And there are 3 reasons that this conspiracy theory kind of holds some water. First, it's that Donald Trump wants to lower interest rates. Just today, he demanded the Federal Reserve lower those rates. He cares a lot about interest rates. The White House is very concerned about U.S. bonds, but also interest rates determine how much money he personally has and can have, because the ultra-wealthy don't handle money the way that you and I do. It's all money on paper that's locked up in equity balanced against loans from banks. But if interest rates go up, he'll owe more, and getting a new loan to pay for the old loan will be more expensive, meaning he'll have less net worth and less money. The other 2 reasons are purely political. Republicans right now are trying to pass their tax cut plan. If the economy continues to tank and we slide into a recession, it'll be easier to market this tax cut bill as some relief from higher prices. Except we know, and I've said this quite a few times on the show before, but we know from independent analysis from pretty much across the political spectrum that Trump's tax cut plan will only really benefit people who make more than $950,000 a year and will make taxes more expensive for most people in the country. And the third reason is that if the economy tanks and it takes longer than 2 years for things to right themselves, which is likely, Republicans will lose the House and the Senate in the midterms in 2026. And while that's not ideal for Trump or Republicans in terms of getting things done, it does help them in 2028. And Republicans are better in the minority. They're just more comfortable there. They like to pick fights as the minority. They like to obstruct and hold things up. They like to be seen fighting for their voters as the underdog. And Trump gets to be the hero in this story again, while assuming at 82 he doesn't try to run illegally for a third term for president. Whoever the Republican candidate for president is gets to copy and paste Trump's 2024 campaign on high prices, and that they alone can fix it because the Democrats have spent the last 2 years, that would be 2026 to 2028, breaking things, even though these tariffs would have broken them in the first place. Now, do I think everybody is playing that kind of four-dimensional chess? No. I think what this really is that Trump likes tariffs and he wants to put them in place, and nobody in the White House can actually tell him no. But we are going to leave the tariff stuff there, and I'm sorry that was long. I know you're feeling a little dizzy. I certainly am. If that lasts more than 4 hours, you should talk to a doctor, at least while you still can, because that gets us to our next topic here, the gutting of U.S. health agencies. This week, more than 62,000 federal employees were fired from the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, and other agencies that were part of the Health and Human Services Department, which Secretary of Health Robert F. Kennedy renamed this week the Administration for a Healthy America, or AHA, which comes from his own doctor, who said that when he found a worm in his brain, like, that explains it. The tens of thousands of cuts were made across the board, decimating and even destroying offices and labs that kept track of things like smoking, gun deaths, lead poisoning, air pollution, medical device safety, food safety, managing things like the portals for the Affordable Care Act so people can have health insurance, and for Medicaid and Medicare services. Those cuts also hit one of Kennedy's key positions, which is he thinks the U.S. spends too much money on studying infectious diseases and making sure they don't spread, which, first of all, isn't true. We spend most of our research money on things like chronic diseases like heart disease or cancer or arthritis and the effects of obesity and tooth decay. But mostly, these cuts mean the U.S. will no longer be a leader in the world when it comes to research on health. We're talking things like mRNA vaccines, HIV and AIDS care, and thousands of other areas of health that we don't even think of, but are vital to making sure that not just Americans stay healthy, but also that other countries can use that research to keep their people healthy, which means less death, less suffering, and more prosperity. And actually here, because I think you've heard enough of me today, I want to get to our conversation with Dr. Scott Greer. Like I said before, I talked to him just after the inauguration when the future of public health around these things was hypothetical. And now we have to talk about it in the actual. And he's got a brand new article coming out in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which are the folks that have the doomsday clock, the 1 minute to midnight folks. Well, he's got a brand new piece with them about the U.S. pulling out of the World Health Organization. And we talk about how America retreating from public health is bad for everyone. We saw these things start to come down the last couple days. Really, it was about 2 days ago from when we're recording here on Friday that it was 62,000 people across the NIH, CDC, FDA, and a few other of the HHS, now AHA agencies. These weren't surprises. I mean, they weren't surprises to you, I'm guessing. Were there anything that did surprise you, though, in these cuts?
I think you're flattering me, and I think most other experts. I don't think anybody quite anticipated the cuts that came primarily with DOGE, but came with the arrival of the second Trump administration. I don't think across the board 25% cuts at HHS were anything anybody really anticipated, because first of all, they're so extraordinarily crude. They don't really reflect an analysis of what these agencies are supposed to be doing. And secondly, because they're being done in this cavalier, dismissive way. RFK Jr. said before the election that he would tell most of our infectious disease scientists to go take a holiday. And now he's doing it.
Can I ask about that too? We talked a little bit about this the last time you were here, because we did talk about these things in the hypothetical, and now we're going to have to talk to them in the not hypothetical, the real world implications of this. But compared to other things, NIH, CDC didn't really study infectious diseases on the same order that they did the chronic diseases that RFK Jr. says he wants to study. So where are those things, or where were they, I should say?
We honestly don't know a lot of what's going on, right? There's ridiculous levels of problems figuring out who has been fired legally, which is a much smaller group of people, who has been fired, but we can't ask the communications office because the communications office has been fired, whose grants will be suspended, but the people who were supposed to suspend them have been fired. And then there's the problem that if somebody is fired illegally and then a court puts down a restraining order saying that they can't be fired, what actually becomes of them? And there's a lot of deliberate chaos. There's a lot of things being done in ways that are hard to trace. The signal leak in the Department of Defense is emblematic of an administration that is very, very keen to keep what it's doing away from the American people. So a lot of the answer to these questions is nobody really knows, and it's freezing up the media coverage because by the time you prove something to the standards of a major media outlet, it's weeks old, and people inside the bureaucracy are wondering why you're so slow.
Right, right. In the bureaucracy, they're wondering why we're so slow. Right. The irony there is staggering to me, right? Uh, and then I think there's also this thing that you'd mentioned before, that we just didn't see this coming because so many of these institutions, these research labs, the way these grants are put out, the way that these agencies operate, were done in good faith. They could not have predicted that somebody would come in and act in such a bad faith manner towards public health. Tell me about that idea.
Okay. And this is separate from the cuts, right? Like there was a premise that the NIH would staff itself to be able to evaluate and fund research, and we've broken that promise. But when you look at a lot of the details of things like our drug safety system, our system for testing dead animals that people send in, dead wild animals, to see if there's some sort of a zoonotic disease floating around, our system for choosing vaccine formulas, for recommending vaccines, for dealing with potential side effects. The common denominator of all of this is that it assumes a government run by people acting in good faith. It assumes that CMS is run by somebody who wants to actually do its mission and fund Medicaid and Medicare. It assumes that the FDA is here to promote, as its legislation says, pure food and drugs. It assumes that CDC is there to control and prevent disease. You can't make that assumption anymore. You have to assume now that systems built on an ethos of service and professional responsibility are being run by a variety of grifters and ideologues. And that's going to produce problems that people working in the system don't have the ingenuity to imagine. Nobody has ever sat down and looked through the entire vaccine system to figure out how it can be hacked by an anti-vaccination, interest-conflicted secretary.
When we talk about these cuts, and yes, there's so much that's unknown, this whole episode is about the U.S. pulling back from the world. And if we cut the knees out of the CDC, of the FDA, when it comes to things like food safety and medical device safety, and the NIH, not to mention USAID, we lose a lot of just the medical knowledge and security around the world. So for you, what are the things that...
No. Well, they're coming thick and fast, right? So, for example, there's an unexplained delay in the final approval of the Novavax vaccine, which is a COVID-19 vaccine. And it's available under an emergency authorization from the pandemic, but Novavax isn't just another COVID-19 vaccine. It's also essentially a new technology that the reason it was kind of slow was we were building the system and the science to make an entirely safe new kind of vaccine. Well, it hasn't received its approval. We don't know why. Maybe they fired the person who was supposed to organize the meeting, and maybe it's something more nefarious. They're putting a block on mRNA research. mRNA vaccines didn't just produce the best anti-COVID vaccines, but they could produce fantastic vaccines against all sorts of things. They're trying to apparently cut research onto nasal COVID vaccines, because the COVID vaccines we have, of course, go into your arm. And the point is to keep you from being hospitalized or dying. And they're great at that. A nasal injection would be even cooler because it would mean you're less likely to get COVID at all.
Wait, why would a nasal vaccine mean that it would be harder to get COVID at all?
Okay, so as Ed Yong famously said, immunology is where common sense goes to die, right? So broadly, the way the immune system in your nose and mouth works, as you would predict, it's the front line against a lot of the world. It works differently from the immune system down into your lungs and deeper into your organs. So the vaccine we have is premised on allowing, your lungs and the immune system to fight against COVID being really bad. The nasal vaccines are geared towards training very precisely the immune system, the cells found in your kind of nose and mouth and throat, to recognize COVID and get rid of it before it has a chance to get any further in. That's the very simplified version of it.
Sure. It's still amazing that that's incredible. And we're just not going to do that anymore, apparently.
Apparently. It does have a news you can use dimension, which is check your vaccines, check your kids' vaccines. For example, a lot of the Republican Party does never like the HPV vaccine, which is a miracle. It's a vaccine against cancer. And you can have it as young as 9. And I think there's going to be a concerted attempt to manipulate the system to make HPV harder to get. And how about another example in the news? It's measles. We used to be a measles-free country. We fixed that. For a variety of reasons, you might not have as much measles immunity as you think, and you probably don't remember the MMR vaccine unless you were a wildly precocious baby. So it's not stupid to go get tested, ask your doctor for a test that says essentially what's your immunity level, and have a conversation about whether you should get another MMR shot, because once there's a proper measles outbreak, we're going to discover what we're already seeing in parts of Texas, which is that the industry doesn't produce huge amounts of extra measles vaccine for fun.
Right. Why would they?
So if we get a good panic going, we could end up with, a measles vaccine shortage.
Which would mean that agencies that we've just laid off tens of thousands of people wouldn't have the ability to ramp up to meet that outbreak where it is.
And the industry, right? One of the big questions that people outside the United States have is, if you have a United States in the hands of anti-vaccine forces, what happens to the American vaccine market? Mm-hmm. Because if I'm trying to decide whether or not to bring a new vaccine to market, I have questions about whether or not I can access the American market. And I have questions, for example, about whether our legal system will be weaponized against me for my, on the grounds that there's some kind of a side effect.
Right. That you actually kind of were bringing me to my next point here, which is if we pull out from the NIH and the CDC, or we don't pull out, we cut it off the knees, and we've already pulled back from WHO, the World Health Organization. And we can even keep it in this example of vaccines. What happens to the safety of global health? And I know that this does get into your new piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which do they let you move the arm, the minute hand on the atomic clock to midnight?
They're scientists. They have a proper committee, but it's got very, very close to midnight lately.
But let's talk about this and pulling out of WHO and what that means for the world and the safety of how we understand global health, because the U.S. up until a couple days ago was really the place to go for good health advice, and that's not going to be the case anymore.
Yeah, there's already been extraordinary things. We've seen months of fights over censoring the CDC website. We've seen an organization that RFK Jr. founded, which basically set up a fake CDC website. Extraordinary stuff. Not what is supposed to happen in the United States. Global health. The way to think about it, I would say, is that we do 4 big things in global health. One is our science establishment, which is the envy of the world and enormously influential, and we're kneecapping it. One is WHO, where we provided about 16% of its budget and a lot of its direction. One is USAID, which had 10,000 employees and is on track to have 0 within a month or 2. This is, of course, completely illegal, but that isn't really a big problem in early 2025. And the last that I want to single out is PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Response, which is a very large program that was born not just as a bipartisan program, but as a program that was part of George W. Bush's commitment to evangelical Christians. And it is focused on providing highly active antiretroviral treatments to people in Africa. And broadly, global health has been the starring success of the whole post-World War II development and aid agenda, right? We've achieved more in life expectancy than we have by building dams or roads or running workshops. And PEPFAR is probably the crown jewel of that. If you had the award for greatest impact on humanity, it would be up there with smallpox eradication and the near eradication of polio. And it also sustained a whole ecology of organizations in Africa, in universities around the world, conferences, journals, blogs, people. So it didn't just directly provide antiretroviral therapy to a lot of people who needed it and saved their lives and allowed them to contribute to society. It also underpinned a lot of other work, because once I have an organization with stable PEPFAR funding, I can reach out and work on eradicating something else, guinea worm.
So then what happens to, let's say, global health research? Not maybe around AIDS, but also I think in general, does somebody else step in to replace the US? Is it the EU? Does China's health ministry come in? I'm not even sure what the actual name of the Chinese health agency is, the full name, but who steps in?
Broadly, nobody. So you start with the fact that WHO has been kneecapped, and it's I keep using that word. It's my word of 2025, I fear. And we've walked off with 16% of its budget, and because of the way the fiscal years are working, we've actually taken more than that out of it, just because of the difference between US and WHO fiscal years. So it's a huge emergency there. Who's going to step in? There's three real candidates. The first is the People's Republic of China. Now, the PRC has consistently paid their mandatory membership fee, so to speak, and $1 million extra. That doesn't look to me like a country that's planning to use WHO for power projection. And a lot of what they like to do when they're busy building bilateral relationships is kind of what we call gray infrastructure. They'll build you roads. They'll build you railroads and ports. And so what you're seeing already, for example, in Africa, is them moving in very, very clearly, including looking over USAID projects and picking the ones that they want to take over and fund. So all the goodwill we bought with a project in a given African country, if anybody's going to get the goodwill, it's China. But they don't seem that interested in global health. And if they are interested, they do it bilaterally. They don't want to work with the WHO because it's hard to control. The second is philanthropies. It's Bill Gates. And this is another way rich Americans are very important. The Gates Foundation is one of the largest funders of WHO, and it has apparently closed down all of its climate change work in order to refocus on preserving what public health they can, because Gates sees the ROI on things like HIV treatment. And they've driven a lot of the WHO agenda, but even the Gates Foundation doesn't have the kind of money that the US has. And that leaves the Europeans. And the Europeans have a lot of other things on their plate right now. They are massively investing in defense. They are not just buying stuff, they're also working to build defense industries that don't rely on us because they don't trust us and don't want to buy products where Americans might be able to avoid selling replacement parts or switch off the software or something. Their economies haven't been great, even though the stimulus of defense expenditure might help them. And global health has, in a sense, fallen into their laps. The European Union's the only country that has clearly said it supports and wants to strengthen WHO. Countries like Japan, the UK, Australia kind of fall in line with it most of the time. If they don't spend an extra dollar, they're going to end up much more important, because they're basically a block of about 40-ish countries that contribute a huge share of the budget. They don't have to spend an extra dollar on WHO, and they will end up driving its agenda and its activities.
But they weren't doing nearly the same amount of research that the U.S. was doing, right? I mean, we were the leaders on this. They didn't have to.
It's incomparably different. The sums of money involved in American science until January were immense. One way to put it is that if you add the research expenditures of Johns Hopkins, Michigan, and just to make up the number, the College of Agriculture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, that's the equivalent of Spanish R&D for the whole of Spain. I think people don't recognize it. We're 43 billion-ish for USAID, 51 billion-ish for NIH. NIH spends on health alone in about 2 years what the whole 7-year horizon research agenda for the European Union proposes to spend, or on 7 years across everything. So a few lucky American scientists might be able to decamp to Europe, but nobody is proposing to spend the kind of money that the United States spends. So it's going to be a deadweight loss.
That would then tell me a couple things here, and this comes back to the grifters that are going to be and already are fully in our health systems. It opens the door for people then to fill those spaces who are acting in bad faith, or maybe not bad faith, but are just pushing things that don't work. I mean, Dr. Mehmet Oz was just confirmed to lead the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. Obviously, RFK Jr. is in there, but then the whole host of the Make America Healthy Again movement is now going to fill the vacuum left behind.
Part of the problem is that in many ways their movement wasn't set up to take over and run NIH, right? Like they can't summon enough grifters in a sense to consume the NIH budget. And there's a larger problem, which is if the Trump administration establishes the principle, which so far the Republicans in the House and Senate have led it, that it basically has total freedom to decide how to spend money and doesn't need to pay attention to congressional intent. Well, what does happen to the USAID budget? There's no USAID to spend it. Where does it go? And by the same token, there's about 1.8 billion on the last number I saw of NIH money that should have been spent, hasn't been spent. Where does it go? Who gets to spend it? On what?
As I've been thinking about these things, and you and I kind of talked about it before as well, is that maybe if there is any kind of silver lining, whether it's threadbare or not, it's that these things are broken, potentially irreparably, to get back to the way that they were. So is there a world post-Trump in which we can build these agencies back better? Is that a thing?
I think that's exactly what we need to be thinking about, because you can't just be reactive, right? I want universities to take collective action to preserve science, because right now the Scooby-Doo strategy of splitting up and getting caught one by one is working out exactly like you'd think. But equally, we want to argue for something better. I don't think there's a lot of people who say that what we want is the FDA of December 2024. We want a better FDA. And after you've broken the public service bargain that you're allowed to be a mission-driven person doing public service at a low salary and good job security, you've broken that. Well, how do we create an agency that people are going to want to fight for now and work in 2029? And that's actually kind of a good, inspiring question, so that you're not just cataloging what the vandals are doing. You're thinking about, all right, since we're going to have to rebuild USAID because USAID is gone, well, what should it look like? What would you do with $43 billion and a clean slate?
Right, because that money isn't going away. We don't know where it's going right now, but it's, in theory, not going away. Congress has still mandated money for USAID, for CDC, for NIH, all these places.
I don't want to step on the news and review section of your podcast, but we are heading into one hell of a showdown when they have to actually write a budget.
Yeah. Yes.
So, and things like PEPFAR reauthorization is up. They're just not doing anything, right? So PEPFAR is just going to quietly go away if they don't reauthorize it. So then, once again, do you want to reimagine PEPFAR? Do you want to fight to put PEPFAR back? And PEPFAR has a lot of partners in Africa who have learned a lesson about what kind of a friend the United States is, and they might be a little more hesitant to trust us and collaborate with us.
I know this is a political question, and it is my last one, so you can choose to answer this or not, however you want to. Do you think that the savvy politician, Republican, Democrat, whoever, is going to be the politician who decides to stake out claims about health in this way? When we start to see cuts to things like CMS, or we start to see cuts to things like PEPFAR that matter to people, is that the way to go?
I think that RFK is still leaning on the sort of broad plausibility of the health grifter industry, the sense that some vitamins from the aisle in Walgreens might be good. But that's going to start to go south. For example, there's an enormous number of people who are conservatives and believe in vaccines. And they're not exactly represented by this very conservative government. With foreign aid, it's a little bit trickier, but I mentioned PEPFAR was a George W. Bush thing. And while the sort of process sounds like the worst buddy comedy movie ever. John Bolton and Anthony Fauci went on basically a road trip around Africa asking what would be the most effective way to support health in Africa. But PEPFAR was bipartisan in the sense that Democrats supported it for all sorts of grounds. And in the Republican Party, its support was evangelicals. Have they bailed? Can you reconstruct that coalition?
The ways to put it back together are there. It's just, we need to sort of, I guess, leave this haze that we're in right now. And that'll happen when the consequences hit.
A lot of this is downstream of what happens to American democracy, right? Like, if we decide that the president writes the budget independent of Congress, we've dialed back several centuries in terms of constitutional development, and it's going to change our conversations. And the way it's going to work is things like a cratering stock market and a persistent out-of-control measles outbreak are gradually, and it's actually happening very quickly by the standards of public opinion, they're feeding back into a sense that this has gone off the rails. Now, the problem is the American constitutional system doesn't generate new leadership when you need it. It generates new leadership at 4-year intervals.
Yeah.
So what do we do for the next 3 3/4 years?
I guess we just keep whatever we do to make sure that minute hand doesn't tick any closer to midnight. Well, Scott, thank you so much for doing this again. I really appreciate it.
It was fun. Looking forward to hearing it.
All right. Now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. This week, Donald Trump finally put in place what he's calling reciprocal tariffs on countries across the world. Those tariffs right now don't make a lot of sense to a lot of people in economics or who understand the math of these things, but it has already caused places like China and the European Union to start putting on other tariffs on the U.S. And tariffs are costs on goods that we pay as consumers in the end. Right now, estimates say that we might be paying in the end as much as $6 trillion extra dollars on things that we buy as these tariffs go into place. And markets tumbled this week after those tariffs hit these countries to the tune of about $30 trillion that got wiped out from the economy. Why is Trump doing this? Well, he says he wants to do it to bring back manufacturing to the U.S. Will that work? Probably not. We didn't see it during his first term. Most economists agree it's too painful in the long run to see any real gains. And on top of that, there are rumors that Trump might actually be trying to cause a recession because it might be beneficial politically for 2026 and really 2028. Elsewhere in the government this week, the United States cut tens of thousands of federal employees from our health agencies, which means the U.S. is no longer going to be a leader on the world public health stage. And right now, there is just nobody who's going to be able to step in to do that work, which means a lot of people around the world are going to get sick and stay sick without that research. And here, I've realized over the past few weeks, I haven't been doing this, and I want to bring this back into the show. It's, now that you know this stuff, what can you do? And with a lot of these things, it's call your representatives. Tell them that you do care about this and that you're angry and upset or worried about these things if you are feeling that way about this. Also, it's a good time right now to take a look at your finances, talk with whoever you have that you talk with about these things, and make sure when it comes to health that you're up to date on all of your health needs, your vaccines, your medication, that you know that you can find those things. Talk to your doctor about getting ready to live in a world in which a lot of these things might be more expensive or harder to find. I want to thank Dr. Scott Greer for coming back on the show this week. If you want to find a link to his brand new article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you can find that in the notes for this show. Also, some of the other great work he's been doing at the University of Michigan. And that is it today. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like and subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any of the video episodes here. You can subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I'll have more from Dr. Scott Greer up this weekend. I've been having some trouble with the extended interviews the past few weeks. Substack is being finicky again, so hopefully that'll get up to you on Sunday. If not, it'll be in your feeds next week. And as always, please share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.